Okay, shall I get started? Um, so I wanted to quickly talk a little bit about sexual selection, and this is always sort of very fun to talk about. And I don't know how many of you are interested in sexual selection at all, but maybe one of you will get interested and do some fantastic theory on it. So here are examples of these birds of paradise, and I strongly urge you to go and look at these birdsofparadiseproject.org. They have these videos of all of these birds courting, and it is insane and ridiculous what they do. So this bird, here are its eyes, these two spots, and its beak is here. And it's basically taken up all of its feathers and done this, and then it dances around. It looks like a smiley face. And here's the female, right? And she's sort of maybe partly interested. Here are all these other male birds of paradise that have these bizarre displays and crazy colors and feathers. And people have been fascinated for years trying to figure out what are these birds doing? How have these crazy things evolved, right? So we also have a lot of these insane birds in our backyards here in India. So these are, many of them are from Borneo or Indonesia. I think actually many of these are from Guinea, Papua New Guinea, right? But we have sort of, have any of you seen flycatchers? Have any of you seen the racket-tailed drongo, which has pretty sweet rackets? What are the birds that we have in the Western Ghats with these long frilly tails? White. No, not the drongo. No. These sort of long. No birders amongst you? Okay, fine. Anyway, there are these pretty birds we have in India. Go take a look at them. They also do bizarre things. Sorry? That's a butterfly. No. Okay, anyway, so people have been interested in understanding sex and sexual selection for a long time. And sex is actually paradoxical if you think about it, right? Because it entails cost. So sexual females have only half the fitness as asexual females, right? Because they're essentially sharing each offspring. Half of the genome comes from the partner, right? The male whose genome is also being contributed. And so if you have an asexual female and a sexual female, and they're each producing 2 offspring, right? The asexual female gets all of her genome into every offspring, whereas a sexual female has a net benefit of only a single offspring from 2 offspring, right? Because she only gets half of her genes into the offspring on average. So sexual females pay a cost compared to asexual females, and so one would think that asexual females should sort of take over the world and sexual females should not be able to survive. Also, what happens is sexual recombination breaks up beneficial gene combinations. So we talked a little bit earlier about how you can have 2 mutations and they may interact in some way so that they're beneficial potentially, right? So if you think of many traits in complicated traits that we exhibit, for instance, things like skin color or hair texture and stuff like that, they're controlled by many genes. And so many of the traits that we exhibit that are essential for us as well, not just skin color and hair color, which are completely inconsequential more or less. You can imagine that there are combinations of genes and alleles that you need to have to be able to function and survive and reproduce, right? And you can break up those combinations, which can be extremely deleterious. So the idea is when sexual recombination occurs, you break up these beneficial combinations which have evolved over multiple generations to work well with each other. So that's another cost which asexual species don't have to pay. But sex also has benefits. One major benefit that we think is important for sex is that it slows down Mueller's ratchet. So Mueller's ratchet is a hard concept to understand unless you know what a ratchet is, which I had no clue what a ratchet was. So when I first learned about Mueller's ratchet, I was very puzzled for a very long time. So a ratchet is this machine that they use for, I forgot what they use it for. The point is that it looks kind of, it has these directional 2 teeth in one direction, right? So it's like these gear wheels that rotate and they point in one direction. And so what it means is that you can't pull it in the other direction, right? So once you start going in one direction, that's all you can do. You can't come back. And so the idea here, and this person Mueller came up with this idea, is that as you keep going along and accumulating mutations across generations, you'll keep accumulating some deleterious mutations as well, right? So let's say initially they don't get thrown out of the population, they're not so bad, right? So you manage to survive, you manage to reproduce a little bit. But as you go along, every lineage is going to keep accumulating more and more and more deleterious mutations until eventually you will have very strong selection working against you, and then bam, you lose those mutations. Okay, so that is Mueller's ratchet. And now what happens is this Mueller's ratchet is slowed down in sexual populations because of recombination, right? Because every time you, let's say you have 2 deleterious mutations now, the next generation, chances are because of recombination, one of them will be lost, right? Because it will segregate into a different gamete. Whereas in asexual populations, there's no such option, right? You have that mutation, you will inherit it in the next generation. And so then any new deleterious mutations are always going to occur on the background of pre-existing mutations. And so this slowing down of Mueller's ratchet is potentially one major benefit that sex has. And as recombination breaks up beneficial combinations, it also generates new combinations of alleles, right? So if you had 2 independently beneficial mutations, they can now be combined into a single genome, which can't happen in an asexual genome, right? That asexual genome would have to wait for the second mutation to happen on its own. Does that make sense? And so what people have really tried to figure out, and there's no one clear, obvious answer yet, and maybe there isn't one across organisms, is how these things play out and which of these benefits is actually sufficiently large to overcome these obvious deleterious effects.
As to when exactly differentiation in sex came about?
I believe not. What we do see is different sort of forms and kinds of sex that do seem to show up. So the clearly sort of 2 sex systems that we know in mammals and many fish, birds and so on, sort of those systems are seen in many protists. A lot of protists also have mating types where they'll sort of have a set of molecules that they display, and if the same set of molecules are present on 2 cells, they will not mate. But if slightly different versions are present, they will mate. And there's multiple mating types. So I had a friend who studies mating type evolution in ciliates, and there's at least 7 that she knows in that one species that she's worked with. So it's much more complicated, and it's not as clear a dichotomy. Sometimes they can also switch. So the short answer is eukaryotes we know, yeah. So with bacteria, as far as I know, there are no real examples of sort of clear sex being involved. What might be called potentially sort of like sex is the fact that there are some plasmids which will harbor the genes that allow movement of that plasmid from one genome to another, from one cell to another. And those might be thought of as the male donor and the female acceptor in some sense. But because once you acquire the plasmid, now you have the ability to donate, it becomes more complicated. And it's also one direction then. So yeah, so I don't think we know exactly when sex evolved. And it's also partly problematic because we are still discovering sort of older and older systems or newer systems where we do see some signatures of sex and recombination. So for a long time, for instance, people thought that rotifers, these little microscopic creatures that live in water typically or around water, we thought that they were asexual. And there were this fantastic sort of textbook example of, here's this enormously successful lineage which is completely asexual. How is that possible and how is that happening? And then Matt Messelson and other people discovered that they actually do have sex once in a while, or they're facultatively sexual. So in some rotifer species, when they are in sort of bad conditions, poor conditions and poor nutrition, they start becoming more and more sexual. They start recombining. And then otherwise, there's only females that only reproduce clonally. So all kinds of variations are possible. And so this is actually, a set of sort of theory that really needs as much work as it can get. So if any of you are interested, I would highly strongly suggest you look it up and read more. Coming back to sexual selection itself, we think that there is sexual selection which is typically imposed by one member one sex in a species. So we often tend to think of examples where females are more choosy than males. And Trivers and Hamilton came up with these ideas where they suggested that the reason we see these patterns is that reproductive investment is quite different between males and females. So the typical general idea, which is not always true, there are plenty of exceptions, but generally what seems to be true is that sperm is cheaper than eggs, typically. And so the idea is a female should be more choosy about who she mates with because she's investing much more per offspring. And so her investment is bigger, and so she has to be more careful about the returns she gets. Whereas for males, they can be much more indiscriminate about mating because the sperm that they make is cheap, right?
That come under parental investment.
Yeah, yeah. And so the bigger set of theory, like he's saying, is about parental investment. How much does either sex invest in parental care when there is parental care? But this part of this theory works without any parental care at all, right? So it's just plain and simple mating and how much time and energy needs to be invested in each case. Yeah.
I have one question about the previous slide. You talked about the cost and benefits of sex. So I believe there would be a lot of mathematical models quantifying the characteristics.
Yeah.
So are those models satisfactory? Or do they give satisfactory explanation about evolution of sex?
Yeah, to some extent, right? But the problem is that you keep finding so many examples where the models don't fit at all or can't explain what's going on. And honestly, I don't know that field well enough, so I don't know. But what I do know is that there's lots of models that continue to be generated, and so I imagine that not everything is quite satisfactory about the existing models. Yeah. So I think one of the features that we don't understand, for instance, is this sort of switching between sexual and asexual lineages. What should be the frequency of that? What should be the triggers that generate it? Under what circumstances can you definitively say that sex will outcompete asex or vice versa, and so on. So I think there are lots of details that we don't understand yet. Okay, so the other aspect of sexual selection is that there is then variation in reproductive success of males when females are choosy, because females, of course, can't be, there's no sense in females being choosy if there's no variation in the males, right? So this is essentially exactly analogous to what we said about natural selection earlier. If you don't have variation, selection can't act upon it, right? So females can only be choosy if there's variation in male reproductive success. And so one way that people have actually tried to measure or estimate how much sexual selection is acting in populations is to measure the degree of variance in male reproductive success. Okay, and so people can say that if in a particular population you find that you have a pretty wide distribution of male reproductive fitness, that suggests that sexual selection is acting in this population or could be acting, which has a lot of problems with it, so I would not recommend doing this. There's a lot of debate about what is the best way to actually estimate how much sexual selection is acting on a particular trait. So the idea here also is that one sex competes for access to the other sex, and is that other sex which is exerting choice, right? So in the typical examples that we think about, it's the males that are competing with each other for access to females, and females are the ones who are being more choosy. And so the idea is that this potentially explains why in species such as birds, right, we see these flagrant displays from the male birds, because they are competing with each other to get females to mate with them, and the females are exerting all this strong choice for getting the most extravagant males, right? And the idea is that which is the sex which is going to be choosy is affected by the operational sex ratio. What is the operational sex ratio? What's the ratio in the population of males and females, right? So there are some very nice examples where it's actually the males who are choosy and females are the ones who are competing against each other, right? And this is, for instance, seen in seahorses, where the males are the ones who are taking care of the offspring. So they have a brood pouch, and the female deposits the eggs in the pouch, and then she goes away, and the male takes care of the eggs and so on, of the babies when they come out.
Tend to sort of take 1:1 ratio as something holy. Considering that there are a lot of like ants or like hippopotamus where the sex ratio is extremely skewed and stuff like that. So is there any way, like by looking at things, can you say that, can you justify a certain sex ratio? Why this is the optimum?
Yeah, good question.
Under certain thing, whatever.
Yeah, so Fisher, one of these gods of population genetics, had this very nice simple explanation, actually building on what Darwin had mentioned in his book, which said that given some skew in reproductive investment from males and females, what was going to happen is basically evolution will change the reproductive investment, the relative investment in succeeding generations, such that the operational sex ratio is typically going to be 1 at equilibrium. So that's what it will come to, because what's going to happen is that if you now have an excess of male offspring in the next generation, right, the males are going to compete much more for the smaller number of females, so that in the next generation, it's going to be much more beneficial to be a female than a male, right, and so on and so forth. And so the idea is, at equilibrium, if not something crazy is going on, then the operational sex ratio is predicted to be 1:1. But there are many departures from this, right? And it's interesting to figure out why there are departures and what selects for it. Yeah. So typically the male is defined as the one who's investing less, which is the cheaper sperm, and the female is investing more typically.
In case of seahorse, that's not the case, right?
Well, in the eggs and the sperm, it's still the same, but there the parental care is what increases the investment. So in the gametes themselves, you can define male and female gametes.
You eliminate the chance of male ever investing more than female.
No. So what you, I mean, you also, yeah. Fair enough.
Is it well defined sperm and egg concept? Which one will be called sperm? Which one will be called egg? We are cells from the different organisms.
I think so.
Is it well defined in every species? Which one will be called?
I mean, most species you and I think of normally, yes, but I'm trying to think of sort of weird species, and I don't honestly know the answer there.
What is the differentiating factor, like in cellular nucleus?
Well, so
That's in humans.
no, but that's no. Yeah, sorry. Usually, but sometimes the difference is not very large between sperm and eggs. Eggs are typically non-motile, sperm are typically motile, but again, I don't. Yeah.
Are eggs always XX? And
No, there are different systems in different organisms. So, for instance, birds and butterflies have the opposite system, where the males are homozygotic. The males are essentially the same allele, and the females are heterogametic. Yes, heterogametic.
Inseminate?
No. Egg is not a, yeah.
It's just X or Y?
Yes. Yeah.
It can't be Y.
Sorry?
Just X. It can't be Y. Is that the?
No, he's asking males and females, are females always?
Is that or was the question about
XX.
eggs?
No, the egg is only carrying one of them, right? So, there are two kinds of gametes that each individual is making, right? And now depending on which gametes combine, you will get male or female offspring. So an egg or a sperm can be only one. Sorry, I thought you were asking about individuals.
a female can produce X and Y eggs.
So in some species, yeah, basically there are species where the female is XY, the counterpart of XY. It's called ZW just to help us identify, but essentially the idea is the same.
So is the female determined, like what is a female is determined by which of the cells is contributing extra chromosomal traits as well? That is what defines the female,
Often, yes.
but it's not always applicable.
Not always. I think in humans as well, there's this very, very rare occurrence where sperm actually also contributes some mitochondria and some extra nuclear DNA, but very rarely. But yeah, I think typically that might be another, yeah.
Otherwise, like based on these XYs and all, otherwise it won't that.
No. So you don't use the XY to define that anyway, right? But so you don't sort of look at XY or ZW and say that's a female or that's not a female and so on. You use the fact of their reproductive investment and what kinds of gametes they're producing to say it's a female or a male. And in some cases where there is sex, we cannot clearly identify, I mean, there is sexual reproduction, but we can't really call one of them as male and one as female. It's very hard to define. Where, for instance, reproductive investment is very similar, can't say.
Okay, I have two questions. First, is there any species where the male sperms are costly and female eggs are cheaper? First question. And second one, is there any cause and effect relation between the first point and the third point?
Okay, so I don't know immediately of any species where sperm is more expensive to make than eggs, but I feel like there must be examples of this. I just don't know of them. The first and the third things.
First is the reason for the third. The first may be the cause.
Yeah, so that's the idea. Is the first is sort of the underlying cause of any differentiation between the sexes at all, right? Because if essentially both sexes are, I mean, both are clearly giving similar genetic material, similar amounts of it. So the only thing that differentiates the two sexes is really what else they are adding to the mix, right? And so typically the female is defined as the one that adds more and invests much more, and the male is defined as the one that invests less. So if there is no such distinction though, you can't really distinguish male and female then.
Male or the female, or yeah, one of them invests more than the other?
No, that's what I'm saying is in some cases there isn't a clear distinction, right? So, yeah, or I mean, I'm trying to think of, for instance, marine organisms. There are lots of them which broadcast spawn, and so both the gametes are sort of broadcast in the water, and then they hope that they find the other one and form zygotes. And so there, I'm trying to think of any differences, and I
Yeah, I was thinking
think they really
so,
exist.
so you said this F plasmid bacteria. So one gives it to the other, but the other doesn't take much. So is it something related to that? Is that how it's evolved, or it's just
No. I mean, for the bacteria, the case is just different. You can sort of make a case for that being donor-receiver kind of thing, but it kind of breaks down pretty fast, because then once you receive the F plasmid, you can now become a donor.
So there are these certain theories that one of the reasons that led to basically sexual differentiation is essentially to basically switch from this very vulnerable external fertilization to something like internal fertilization. So someone basically keeps the zygote as compared to just keeping it outside.
Yeah, but the thing is, even with external fertilization, you often have the two sexes being quite distinct. There are fish where external fertilization is more common, but there's clearly some males and clearly some females in many fish. Okay, let's go on. I want to talk a little bit quickly about what's the benefit of being picky, right? Okay, fine, you're making more investment perhaps, but then why would you still be picky? Sometimes the choosy sex can be picky because they get some direct benefits from it. So there are these things called nuptial gifts, where the males typically will give something extra to the female to convince her to mate. It could be nutrients, it could be food, it could be extra space or a nest that they build. Have any of you heard of bowerbirds? There are these amazing examples people have studied for many years now, where the male bowerbird makes this sort of nest-like thing on the ground in grass and so on. And so he makes, it's called a bower, this sort of structure that he makes, where the female can come and lay eggs. And they have this peculiar fascination with blue stuff. And with humans putting out all kinds of plastic and glass and stuff which is blue, it all ends up in these bowerbird nests, where they decorate the nest and the entrance. It's super elaborate, it's very pretty. So the bowerbirds basically compete with each other for the most blue and the most shiny blue stuff that they can put in their nest, and the female goes and picks the nest she likes best. Anyway, so there's all kinds of direct benefits that the female might get. She might get also a male who is going to provide more parental care, provide more food to her offspring, and so it's in her benefit obviously to have a better male who's a better father. You can also have indirect benefits. You can have, for instance, the female might be looking for better genes for her offspring, right? So let's say, for instance, that some way the female can identify this male is likely to have better resistance against some infection, against a parasite, right? Then her offspring are also more likely to inherit those genes, and they will be beneficial. So that's a good genes hypothesis, which is there's some evidence for. So there's some evidence for all of these hypotheses, but it's clear that there's no single hypothesis that can really explain exactly what the females are choosing based off of. There's also this thing called runaway sexual selection. And the idea is there's this process that sort of could in theory be happening to infinity, where if there are males that are giving something like that are being sort of showy or flashy in some way, right? And the females prefer the most extreme trait in the population, and the female selects for the sort of the funniest or the longest feather or some such thing. And then there's increasing selection then on the male to have even bigger trait value, because the female is always choosing for the extreme, right? And then female choice also evolves along the same pace. And so this is called runaway sexual selection, which again Fisher had proposed. And the idea here is that the females are choosing for sexy sons, right? So in the population, if there's a female preference for the most extreme male trait, then a female who chooses males with that extreme trait is also essentially choosing for her own sons to have more and more extreme trait values, right? Essentially trying to make sure that the next generation, her sons, will have higher reproductive benefits as well.
So when basically everyone is pretty good at like surviving in their environment, then maybe the game finally just decided based on the aesthetics, let's say. So, but the thing is, if you overdo the aesthetics, let's say you develop long things and you essentially, which without you noticing, your flying might be hurt, like let's say, then they'll all go back to basically the old school birds which used to fly properly.
Yeah. So the peacock's tail is a classical example of this kind of debate, actually, right? So what he's saying essentially is natural selection can sometimes oppose sexual selection, right? So you all seen peacocks, hopefully, at this point. And there's some nice work done on peacocks suggesting that peacocks with longer tail feathers have better mating success, right? Male peacocks. And there's some suggestive work also which indicates that peacocks with longer tails are also more prone to predation. And so that kind of idea that by displaying sort of something that's terribly flashy, the males are signaling that, look, I can still deal with this crazy tail. So I'm more prone to predation, but I'm still alive. So clearly I'm doing something correct. It's called the handicap principle, exactly. So there's some evidence again for this handicap principle. So basically the males are using this handicap to suggest that they have something which is fantastic about them and the females should choose them. Again,
They wouldn't have the tail, but they would still inherit some of my other beneficial features.
Yeah.
Therefore, is that the difference? Because otherwise,
You're saying, well, how does the handicap work at all?
yeah.
No,
I mean, in the sense that if I'm doing well despite the handicap,
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily mean I'm doing better than the others without the handicap. Now, what I'm saying, therefore, my offspring will inherit my genes and they will also do about the same. So it's not better. But what I'm saying is that if I have female offspring now,
Yeah.
they will not inherit the handicap.
Yeah.
So at least some of my offspring will do better than the population. Because they will not inherit the handicap, but the other compensating factors. So is that the issue?
No, it's actually for the handicap itself. So the assumption is that the handicap is just a signal. Yeah, I guess, no. So it can also work for the male offspring as well, because they will also they're also likely to inherit whatever good genes there are, which are associated with this handicap, right? Yeah. So they are. The idea is that.
in terms of sexual selection, but in terms of actual.
Yeah, but the idea is that the sexual selection is tied together with natural selection in this example, right? In this principle. That they're opposing each other, and the thing is they're opposing each other, but still this individual has managed to survive. And so as long as the preference is there in the population, so will the sons survive. That's the prediction that the female is making, essentially. Does that make sense?
Had a longer tail and it's more prone to predation. It's developed new strategies to escape predation, right? And that is what you would be selecting for.
It may be, but that doesn't seem to be happening with these peacocks at least. And the thing is that also these peacock data are kind of very, not as fantastic and not as replicated as one would like them to be. So that's why I said that there's some evidence for these ideas. So the thing is, with the handicap principle, there are lots of sets of data that are consistent with the handicap principle, but there may be simple good genes explanations that better explain those data. So when people look at, for instance, mate choice in these groups, they will find that so you independently measure natural selection acting against the handicap that makes it a handicap, and then you independently measure sexual selection, and you find that they are opposing each other, and yet females have this preference that they will choose the handicap. And so they're suggesting that the female is essentially choosing for the handicap partly because the handicap is going to be passed on to her offspring, and they will continue to do better despite the handicap. And the reason for the despite the handicap is partly from the sexual selection itself.
Is there any way of testing the handicap principle versus this simple snowballing effect comes from?
So I guess if it was just a simple snowball effect, it would be like the Fisher's runaway process that you'd expect, right? That you just have increasing preference for trait, and the trait keeps
It's not
increasing.
just a fluctuation and then snowball. So that
Yeah.
require any special.
Yeah. So I think people have definitely theoretically tried to figure this out, but I don't know if there are good experiments where they have been able to tease apart these two things. Yeah, I'd have to look these up again.
So the female has no way of telling how well a male she sees is doing. It just knows whether the male is there or not there. In that case, the size of the handicap is the only sort of gradable information that the female has, because the female has no real measure of how well is the male doing.
I mean, yeah, she could in some cases, but
So
let's
in that
assume
case,
she
a
doesn't.
bigger handicap means doing exists in spite of big handicap, and a small handicap would mean exists in spite of small handicap. So in that case, the size of the handicap is actually a measure of when you're given
Cost you're paying and still so. See, that's the thing, is it's hard. Like, I think he has a very good point that it's the female doesn't know that it's a handicap really, right? So the female just needs to have a preference which is
Rather, my point is the female has no other measure of the male's performance or how good it is or how well it's doing. So in that sense, asking the question, how well is the male doing, compared to other males without the handicap, is not a question which the female can ask. It just knows that the male is there, and it knows the male has a big handicap.
no, but females are able to evaluate, for instance, the frequency of the tail length in the population, right? So female is not seeing just one male at a time. She's able to evaluate across multiple males.
Yeah, in that case, the only graded information she has is the size of the tail.
Yeah, but the question is, why is she preferring the bigger tail size, right? She doesn't have to. That's the question that's really we're trying to answer. Like, why are females choosing whatever it is that they're choosing? Yeah, do something else. Okay, so here's a neutral version of what I mentioned, like what I mentioned earlier, there's genetic drift, right? So it could be something like sensory bias, where the females are just choosing some trait based on some preconceived, like previously existing bias that they have, right? And there's some evidence for this. In the interest of time, I will move on, but this is also very interesting. Look it up, or I'll send you some information if you'd like. There could also be antagonistic coevolution. We will not get into this at this point. Okay, so there's also mate competition, where you have same-sex contests or sperm competition. So basically, if one sex is choosy and the other one is not choosy, and the one that is not doing the choosing is competing with members of its own sex, right? How does that competition play out? So it could play out at different levels. You could have sperm competition, you could have same-sex contests, which you do see often in males of various mammals. You have infanticide. Maybe some of you have heard of lions and many cats killing cubs of other males so that they can get the female to be an estrus again and get access to that female. There could also be scramble competition, where there's basically one localized resource, and then you're trying to get as much of it as you can within a small time frame. There can also be alternative mating strategies, which are super interesting. So there are sneakers. In some fish species, this is very well understood. So they often have this dominance hierarchy, right, where there's a dominant male who gets most of the matings within the group, and then there are other males who don't get much matings. But what these males do is they sort of pretend to be females sometimes and sneak in and get a mating with the real female and go away. Right? So there's very interesting strategies that have evolved. There's also some sequential hermaphroditism. So in bluehead wrasse, smaller females as they grow bigger become males, right? Because bigger males have such a big advantage that if you can actually manage to flip your sex, it's fantastic, and they manage to do it. So in fish, there's pretty much every kind of sexual system that you can think of that people keep finding. Fish are very complicated. They don't seem to, many of them don't seem to actually have a sex chromosome either, which is a very clear sex chromosome. And so it's very interesting and a very sort of hot area of research, trying to figure out how sexual systems work in fish. Okay, so that's the end of my first lecture. We'll try and get through ecology as much as we can. Okay, yeah.
From a physics background. So, so when you were saying about evolution as some genes getting mutations, point mutations, or there being natural selection or all, that was making sense. Now suddenly you came to a level where you were talking about individuals wanting to do that.
Wanting to do what?
I want to mate with that guy who has a longer tail or something like that. Now this is something which is happening at a single generation level.
Within a generation.
Within a generation level. So this is something that is not making sense to me. I mean, this I thought is something happening at the molecular level where there's a lot of stochasticity happening.
Yeah.
The other one, natural selection on a longer time scale where there are environmental effects and things like that. Now you're saying something like wanting to do. So I don't know how that's getting quantified in terms of genes.
Eventually, so you can imagine that, let's say the long tail is given by one gene, which it most surely is not. But you can simplify the situation and say long versus short tail is determined by one gene or a set of genes. Then essentially every time a female is choosing the long-tailed male, she's choosing that set of genes, right? That set of alleles actually. And so those alleles are more likely to get passed on in the next generation. So the choice is simply a form of selection, right? So instead of natural selection, it's just sexual selection. But the idea is the same. So just like a predator will end up choosing to kill weaker individuals in a population, you've all seen these movies on Discovery or something where the lion comes and then grabs like the weakest little calf that's tottering along and can barely walk within a group of herbivores, right? And so those genes or sets of alleles will get out of the population faster. Does that help make sense? No? Okay. Okay, fine. Okay, so with ecology, there are many, many different things that sort of traditionally come under the umbrella of ecology. And I'm just going to give you a brief glimpse of, I don't know, what I think is most interesting and perhaps most relevant with respect to theory. But essentially with ecology, what we're trying to understand is what determines an animal's shape or size, what kind of group size is it living in, what are its behaviors in some cases that have evolved, and those kinds of things, as well as sort of larger scale effects that I'll get into. So population size, and I can't stress this enough, is a key parameter for both ecology and evolution. And we just talked about why for evolution, population size is important. It's also important for ecology because individuals interact with other individuals, right? And so depending on your group size, it's going to be very important. It's going to basically generate the selection pressure that's going to determine what you do or how you evolve. Population size is also an estimate of population health in some ways. So we all sort of have this intuitive understanding that larger populations are in better shape in general of whatever plant or animal you can think of. And they can also be very, very useful to predict future dynamics. And then population size is associated with many other characteristics of a species. So you'll find all these patterns people have documented over the years where, small sized mammals, for instance, tend to have much larger population sizes than large mammals, right? So think of elephants, lions, tigers, relatively smaller population sizes compared to things like rodents, which have huge population sizes in comparison, typically, right? So there is something about the population size of a species that is extremely important and is something that's worth understanding really well. So some basic questions: what is a population? We're going to define a population as a unit which is where interactions within the unit are stronger or more frequent than interactions with other units or outside the unit, right? How do we estimate population size? You can do census counts. You can also measure density, which may often be a more useful parameter. And why is density a useful parameter? Because it really determines access to things like resources or space, right? Which is where competition comes in, and we've seen how competition is such an important feature of evolution. So how many of you are familiar with basic population growth models? If you're already familiar with them, I'll go through them faster. Just 2 or 3, 5 people? Okay. So here's a basic exponential growth model, which is density independent. So what we're saying is, per individual in that species, in that population, what is the rate at which it is going to reproduce, which is going to determine the exponential, which is going to determine the population growth. So here's a simple equation that describes it, and what R is, N is the population size, T is time, and the small r is the intrinsic growth rate. So basically saying per individual, how many offspring are going to be produced, right? So that's the simple, the very basic exponential growth model. And we want to add something like carrying capacity in this, right? I mean, I think intuitively all of us are familiar with the concept of carrying capacity. Essentially, there's a cap on how many individuals can be fit into a given space, which clearly we are very good at exceeding enormously. And so, like I said earlier, the Malthusian idea was that the rate of increase in resources is much lower than the rate of increase in population size. And so famines are inevitable. Right? And he was talking about humans, but he was drawing from data on many other animals. Right? You see rodent populations increasing a lot, and then they come crashing down, and the idea is something then controls those populations. And what is it that controls it? So there's the struggle for existence, which is essentially competition for resources. And fitness is really a consequence of the ability to acquire more resources, to defend them, or to convert them more efficiently into offspring. And if any of you are thinking about deep meanings to life, that's all there is to it, right? So, so this is essentially what populations are facing. Another way to look at population growth, the initial model I showed you earlier, is just simply changed here. You have intrinsic growth rate R. I feel like this slide is repeated. You want to now build in carrying capacity into this, right? And so say there should be some density dependence, right? So as the number of individuals in the population increases, it should become harder and harder to get resources and to reproduce. That seems sensible. Yeah, sorry. No. Yeah, the base you change and then it's okay. Okay, so then we basically can make this equation where we can add in the carrying capacity. And so this is just the simplest way of adding in density dependence. As your n increases and approaches k, this becomes 0, and so your population stops growing. Yeah. Okay, so what about intrinsic growth rate itself? Remember, it's the per capita growth rate, per individual, how many offspring are going to be produced. And one question is, well, why doesn't R keep increasing, right? So it's going to be sort of obvious that if with a mutation, I'm able to produce 2 more offspring compared to any other individuals in my species, then that intrinsic R should be beneficial and should keep increasing. Right? So why don't we see that in species? Why don't all species have insane values of R, right? And so there are many different possibilities, and here's 2 sort of major causes that I'd like to talk about. One is that there's density dependence, and so you can keep increasing R, but if there's a cap and then you're not able to survive that cap once you reach the carrying capacity, you basically will not be able to survive after that equilibrium density is reached. So this is somewhat similar to that persister cell that you guys talked about earlier, where cells that are typically good at, lineages that are good at growing really fast are often not good at persisting better. So there's often trade-offs with density, trade-offs with competitive ability at carrying capacity. And so the idea is if you have density dependence, you might end up putting limits on how much R can be, right? So here's an example of what happens when you change intrinsic growth rates, or what can happen when you change intrinsic growth rates, or the amount of variation in growth rates. So this is data actually from some experiments that I did in my PhD. There's the number of adults of a beetle population over time on the x-axis. And here's populations that had less genetic diversity. Here are populations that had more genetic diversity. The point of this experiment was to test whether their dynamics would be different. And I saw that they indeed were different. So populations with low diversity tended to fluctuate much more. Okay. And so the things that one is interested in when looking at population dynamics, like a population ecologist would be interested in asking how stable is the population size over time, how resilient it is. So let's say here I just plonked in a whole bunch of new beetles, right? Or I took out a lot of beetles. Can the population bounce right back up to its standard equilibrium state, or will it now crash, or will it now go extinct, or whatever? What is the equilibrium, and what are the kinds of stochastic effects that can change these dynamics, and what causes these dynamics to be different, right? So these are the kinds of questions one can ask. There's a lot of work done on these kinds of effects, but there's more to be done. For instance, I don't actually know exactly why these two populations were different. There's one model, total sum of one model that someone had made earlier, which was a population genetic model, actually with a one locus two allele model, which predicted that more heterozygosity should stabilize population dynamics. As far as I know, there are no other models that do this. So I don't really understand why I saw this, right? I have some hypotheses, but I don't know if they're true. Okay, so we have the logistic growth model with density dependence, which I just explained to you. And the idea is if you have a lag in density dependence, so that at this time point, if the density is reaching k, right, it's closing out in k, but then there should be a feedback mechanism, right, where every individual is now sensing the population density and is appropriately regulating their own reproduction. But if there's a lag in that sensing and the feedback, then you're more likely to get population fluctuations. So this is something, again, we know from basic models and simulations people have done a long time ago, showing that if the feedback is faster, you are less likely to get these fluctuations. Okay, so what causes density dependence itself, right? So there could be either intrinsic or extrinsic causes of density dependence. Let me define or give some examples, and that might make it clear. So you can have resource competition, which is typically intrinsic. So it's something which is a property of the population itself. So interactions between individuals, for instance, would be intrinsic reasons, right? Like resource competition. You can also have predation or parasitism, which is extrinsic, right? So let's say at higher densities, some parasite or predator is more likely to find you. And that is what puts a cap on your densities. Does that make sense? No? So a second species coming in and sort of deciding in some sense or determining what the cap is, how many population size, what population size could you have, is an extrinsic method. So your predation pressure increases as your population gets bigger, right? Versus if resource competition determines your carrying capacity, that there's only X amount of food available and only Y individuals can therefore survive, that's intrinsic, because that is a property of your species as well, right? For different beetle species, you could have X plus 10 individuals survive in the same amount of resource. Okay, you can have things like toxic waste accumulation or behavioral modulation. Let's not talk about that. Another very interesting feature of populations which people want to understand is dispersion. So how will individuals in a population be spread out in space, right? So the previous dynamics component was time. Here we have space. So you can have clumped or uniform or random distributions. And one wants to know what determines how a population is going to be distributed. So how many of you think squirrels are cute? Squirrels? Cute? Thumb? Okay, good. Let me show you stuff which says they're not cute at all. So, oh, this is not going to work. So in Yellowstone National Park in the US, we were sort of going around, we noticed these clumps of dead squirrel on the road. And we're thinking, what happens? Like, why are there clumps of dead squirrels, right? Because normally you don't see squirrels in clumps. And then we realized this is what's happening. Like when a squirrel dies, there's a whole bunch of them that come and chomp on them. And then our hypothesis is another car comes along and kills this one as well. I mean, I don't film it, but that's kind of what happens. So So yeah, so basically the behaviors of animals can determine what dispersion you see, right? Here's another gory video that I won't show you other, but the idea is that what regulates populations and what determines how they're going to be distributed is a sort of property of many different features of the species or who it interacts with. Yeah, so one important thing that people have talked about a lot is top-down versus bottom-up control. So whatever feature it is or whatever factor it is that's controlling animal populations could either be something from the bottom, which means that maybe they're not getting enough food, or from the top, which means someone is eating them, right? And there was again a lot of debate about which of those is more important for most species and so on and so forth. There's no real debate as far as I know anymore. Clearly both of them work and both of them work just fine, but it is still a very interesting question about which of these kinds of control measures are going to be more effective or will lead to more stable dynamics of your focal species, right? Or which are more robust to changes in various features. Okay, so there's this concept of R versus K selection. The idea here is that there is some selection perhaps to be a really fast grower or to be a persister in some sense, right? Like you can survive really well at high densities. And I guess I should just say that there's no very strong dichotomy, really. This was an idea that was put forth in the 70s, and you can fit in various species into R versus K selected, but a lot of it is quite gray. And so it's very hard to say exactly what or how a species has evolved to be fast R or sort of deal with K. So in general, you can have these two strategies under competition. You either grow fast or you survive the lean times, which is kind of what this refers to. And there are a bunch of environmental correlates which are associated with selection on either of them. And the idea is if your environment is quite stable over time, right, you should be selected for fast growth. Slow growth. And fast growth should come up most often when the environment is much more likely to fluctuate. So you have resources right now, you don't know if they'll be there next moment, so you better reproduce as fast as you can. Grab as much of the resource. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry. I guess R selection would grow faster. A species with R selection would grow faster.
Yeah.
But I still don't get how a K selection species would survive lean times better than the R selection.
So the idea is that there's a trade-off between being able to grow very fast. So for instance, let me give a physiological example, right? So typically individuals that develop fast or grow really fast will have less fat storage. And so if now resources are suddenly, there is no more resource, they're less likely to actually survive the lean times. Actually survive the lean times because they don't have as much energy stored in their body. Whereas someone who's growing relatively slower tends to have more fat storage and can survive starvation for longer.
Thank you.
Again, that's not always true, but we know this for many insects or rodents and other species. Okay, what are the life history correlates? What we mean by life history is sort of, how fast you grow, how many offspring you have, how long will you live. So these sort of set of traits that deal with your lifespan and what you're doing in your lifespan is called life history. And so the life history correlates are time to reproductive maturity. So typically R selected species will reach reproductive age much faster. Your offspring quality versus quantity. So the idea again is that if you're R selected, you should have as many offspring as fast as possible. So you'll have many more offspring, whereas K selected species are predicted to have fewer offspring of much better quality on average. And your lifespan also. So R selected species typically tend to be to live much less, and K selected species tend to live longer. That's the general dichotomy. As I said, these are extremes. There's a huge gray area in between. Okay, another ecological concept, which is again very important, I think, is the niche concept. Anybody have any idea of what niches might be? Okay, good. So the set of environments which is sort of very specific one. Good. Okay. So it's a suite of biotic and abiotic factors which are necessary for an organism's survival, necessary and sufficient, right? And so Hutchinson came up with this n-dimensional niche space because you can obviously see, so I think Hutchinson was a plant biologist, and he could sort of clearly see that, okay, you need nitrogen, you need phosphorus, you need carbon, you need water, and all these axes just keep exploding. So what he proposed was that there's this multi-dimensional space which defines the niche of a given organism. And if your niche space overlaps a lot, you're going to be strong competitors, right? Your niche space is quite separated, you're not going to be strong competitors. And this sort of has helped a lot of ecology move forward in trying to quantify what niches are. Because we all have some intuitive understanding of niches, but you really need to quantify it for real species to work with it. Yeah. No, but there may be quantitative differences in how much oxygen is necessary or sufficient, right? Where species clearly do differ. I mean, there are species that can deal with relatively less amount of oxygen that are anaerobic and so on. There's also this concept of fundamental versus realized niche. So the idea is your fundamental niche may be what is optimum for your growth or survival, but the realized niche is what you can manage at the moment, right? Either because you are in a different geographic area or because you have competitors who are pushing you out of your fundamental niche into a realized niche. Here's an example. So here's this weevil which lives on wheat and infests wheat, and here's its temperature range. And so it basically can't grow at any temperatures below this, right? This is a contour plot. And then beyond this set of temperatures and moisture content, it is able to grow, right? And so the idea is this is its niche. And if you look at the population size over time, you can see that it can start from a particular population size, and beyond that it is more likely to persist. And if it starts from a population size that's slightly lower, it is more likely to go extinct, partly because the environment is going to cause stochastic changes in how the population is able to reproduce or not, right? So this is basically going back to why population size is critically important, as well as the niche itself is important. You have demographic effects that arise and that drive populations extinct. So two reasons why population size is important. One is that there's genetic effects, so genetic diversity is lower, right? We discussed this earlier. You're more likely to have deleterious alleles show up in small populations. There's also demographic stochasticity, which means that, for instance, if you have only 3 individuals in a population, there's a bigger chance that there's no female in that population. Population is gone, right? Whereas if you have a much larger population, these kinds of demographic stochasticity is going to be much less likely. And so the reason why you'll hear a lot of conservation biologists sort of talk on and on about population size is because it has these dual effects. It's problematic to have a small population size, both because evolution and adaptation become difficult and because these random stochastic changes mean that you can't reproduce at all. What do you mean better sex ratio?
Like 1:1.
More balanced, yes. Yeah. Okay, so what is the response to competition, right? So we've talked about niches and competitions, and yeah, there's lots of competition around. What are the options, right? You can expand your niche. So let's say now you have a mutation that's able to, so that you're able to tolerate a wider set of temperatures. Fantastic. You can expand into a niche that competitors are not exploiting, perhaps. You could monopolize resources, so you could sort of get to be the bully and elbow out everyone else, and that can be beneficial. Or you could increase the efficiency with which you convert your X amount of resource into offspring, right? All of these are viable strategies. The most evidence we have experimentally is for this, but there's nothing theoretically that prevents any of these from happening. As far as I know, there's very little work actually on these aspects of responses to competition. There's a lot more work on the niche expansion concept. There's an example with flies, but I think I'll skip that. So what are the factors affecting niche change, right? So it seems like fine, you can have niche change, and it's very easy to talk about mutations that cause changes in niche space. But there are multiple things that can constrain it. One is that ecological opportunity, right? So you need to have something new to eat to be able to expand into that. You need to be able to expand into that. So physiologically, if the enzymes in your body just are not going to work at 1 degree higher temperature, well, sorry, can't happen. You also need the ability to have an evolutionary response. I think this is fairly obvious by now. How much time do I have? Okay. So you also have a choice between generalist versus specialist. So you could become a specialist, like you can sort of be really good at eating only chocolate, or you could diversify and eat all kinds of dessert, right? And so question is, what is better? And what determines what is better, right? So there can be costs of specialization. It also depends on how stable your environment is. So if you're going to go through cycles of availability of different resources, it's probably better to be a generalist. If there are trade-offs associated with any of these, right? So you could be a generalist perhaps, but then you lose out on efficiency of conversion, so that from every gram of food that you're eating, you're able to produce less offspring, but you're able to use 10 different kinds of resources. So there may be trade-offs involved. And so those will determine what happens and what response a species has. And so optimal foraging theory is this major ecological theory that deals with predicting what should organisms eat, right? What should you eat and how much should you eat, and when is it a good idea to try something new? So when will behaviorally an organism choose to use something new?
A generalist or a specialist?
I don't think there's a general answer for that. So the question is, are migrating species typically generalists or specialists? I don't think there's a general answer. I mean, you could imagine intuitively that they should be generalists, but that's not necessarily true, because for instance, a migrating species could be tracking temperature or rainfall or something, but they could still specialize on one resource, which is quite widespread, right? So then they don't have to be a generalist really.
Sort of to consume so many different kind of stuff, like it's not like we I don't know how exactly we decide that these are the fruits which we can eat and these are the fruits which you can't. So
Watch the monkeys.
okay, so the point is like I assume it's more like a trial and error thing. So it's like, and also probably with in course of time we actually evolved some enzymes which help us to sort of do things. So it's a two-way process, right? It's more like there are things which are not very different from what you can optimally eat. So if you consume them, probably you're in a good track. But if there are things which are strictly forbidden, if you eat them, then probably it's bad. And so I'm saying it acts both ways, as in like
What acts both way? I'm not able to
as in
understand.
like the set of things. So what determines your what is allowed in your platter? As in like like it's a set of enzymes which you can enzymes which are there. But then again, that there is a room for the number of enzymes you have to also increase. That's
going to take some time. I'd rather not try new, completely new bizarre things that I know no one else eats. No monkeys will touch. There's a fruit. I mean, if I go to a forest, I'm not touching anything that I never see any of the local tribals or the monkeys eating. Yeah. Anyway, so I mean, you're right that physiology is also constrained, and it's possible to adapt, but it takes time. So within a generation, usually individuals will not make these crazy choices. Okay, so here's all of these different things that really are important for deciding what an organism should be eating. I'd like to point out each of these. Maybe we talk about behavioral decisions a little bit. We talk about fitness benefits, there's competition, there's ecological opportunity. There's also ancestral baggage, right? So this is a little bit about what set of enzymes you already have, or let's say what's your physiology. So let's say there's this tall tree and it looks like it's fantastic edible fruit which monkeys eat, but if I'm not able to climb the tree because I just don't have the ability to climb this tree, then that's something that is going to constrain whether I'm able to use this niche that's potentially there for the taking, but I can't, right? You also need gut symbionts which are co-evolved. So I think all of you are aware that you have lots of bacteria in your stomach and intestine which help to degrade the food that we eat and convert it into energy. And so this is something that has come up relatively recently, that we have not just gut symbionts, but many other species that we interact with and depend upon to really be able to survive the way we do right now. And so without them, without these co-evolved relationships with other species, most species that we can think of cannot survive. Okay? Not just gut symbionts, I'm saying many different kinds of symbiotic relationships. Okay, so yet another aspect of populations which is interesting and people study a lot is demography. So you can have, if I just go out and count how many children there are in India, right, versus how many middle-aged people, teenagers, how many really old people, what's the kind of distribution you expect to see? Oh, come on. Huh? Sorry? A pyramid where there's most individuals are young. So India is actually one of these weird populations where we have a fat middle, which is going to get even bigger and bigger. So we have lots of, I think the largest proportion, like age group in India at the moment is 15 to 30-year-old or some such number. And that's why if you hear economists, super worried about India, because all these people are going to need jobs in the next 10 years. Where are the jobs, right? Anyway, so that's a separate thing. But basically, it's very important and interesting to know what is this shape of this distribution in a population, right? Because that determines probably what's going to happen in this population, because there's a set reproductive set of people, right? And so if you know, another reason why it's problematic right now for India to have so many individuals in this age group is they're all going to be making babies in the next few years, which is going to increase the population even more, right? And so to be able to predict what's going to happen to a population, you need to know not only how many individuals there are total, but you need to know how many of them are going to be reproductive, how many of them are going to be dying, how many of them are going to be very, very small and will need parental care, for instance. Right? So these are sort of life tables that people make. You can have survivorship as a function of age. So for instance, you all know that babies need care, otherwise they will die, and so on. So your probability of survival as well as your fecundity is different in different life stages, and this is true for most organisms. And so you can't just count up the total individuals in a population and be able to predict what happens next, what's going to happen next generation. Sorry? Fecundity is the number of offspring per individual that will be produced. Okay, this is another interesting life history trait, which is the birth and death rates, right? So here is the number of surviving individuals starting from some number 1,000. And as individuals age, there's sort of three rough groupings that you can make of the kinds of species you see. In some species, the chances of survival are pretty high until for a while, including humans, and then suddenly drops, okay? For some other species, such as many birds, there's a linear decrease in survival probability across age. And many plant species have this thing where initially there's a very high probability of death, but if they make it to this age, then they actually survive pretty well for a long time. Okay? So again, the survivorship curve that's typical of a species is going to determine what happens to that species over time and how its population will change. Okay. Here's one interesting example, which is largely from important for plants, is semal parity versus itroparity. Forget the terms, but what's important is that should you reproduce at one time in your life, or should you sort of reproduce at little intervals of time, right? Because there are obvious benefits and costs associated with each of them. So the number of descendants that you leave if you are a female who is semalparous is the probability that you survive to that age and then the number of offspring you have. But if you reproduce multiple times, the number of descendants is going to be integrated over your entire lifetime, right? So at every age, what is the probability you survive to that age times the probability that you, how many offspring you're going to be producing at that time. So what could be the benefits of each? Or what would you predict? Where would you find semalparous species and itroparous species? So you expect to be semiparous in fluctuating environments, reproduce once and that's that. Okay, fair enough. Anybody else have any ideas? Season of plenty. Okay, so you're saying that you should time your reproduction to be coincident with plenty of resources. Yeah, that's actually what we do see quite often. Any other ideas? I think everyone's tired. Yeah, yeah. So you have to also pay attention to the survival probability, right? So if the chances of your mortality are quite high, you should reproduce now, or the first chance you get. Put all your eggs in that one basket and hope for the best, right? But if you yourself have a very high chance of survival, then it's probably better that you reproduce at multiple times, especially if your environment is unpredictable, right? So there are two different factors here that are both important in deciding what's going to happen. And of course, again, no one's making this decision. This is just what evolves, right? Depending on the circumstances. Yeah.
That is a problem with this multiple reproduction.
Yeah. No, so that's you're right. That your offspring could compete with themselves also. And so typically what people also find is how many offspring should you have in one location at once is something that females do often control. So they won't lay all their eggs in one place, for instance, unless there's plenty of food in that situation. They'll typically sort of lay eggs in batches in different locations. So there are different adaptations that have come up with that as well. I don't know that there's a pattern like that. I think there's quite a bit of variation in every group you can think of. So I can think of some insects which will do this, some that do that. Typically in temperate regions, you'll find that there's only one period of reproduction, and that's largely governed by the fact that there's only one time, for instance, summer or something like that, where the season is perfect, there's plenty of food, but that's it. So the rest of the year, there isn't enough food, and so that determines just very, in a straightforward way, how often would you reproduce. Typically, tropical insects tend to multiply many times throughout the year. But again, that's not a hard and fast rule. That's a general trend.
So MX depends on which strategy you use, right? Typically, the first strategy species have lot of M.
Yeah, good.
So if you produce multiple times, then M is generally small, like in mammals.
Yeah, each M is small, but your sum
Each M
might
is
still
small.
be the same. Yeah.
But fish and frogs, they have large M because they produce infrequently, very small.
Yeah, but even within fish and frogs, there's a lot of variation, right, in how much they produce. The question is, how far can we stretch this theory and explain all the variation that we find?
So is the amount of parental care a factor in?
Yeah, probably is. Yeah, could be. Yeah, exactly. So if your M itself is going to change here over time. Yeah, absolutely. Good. So there's lots of details, and you all should work on these models to figure it out. So yeah, this is also very interesting. So if you have age structure where early offspring are going to be more valuable because female survival decreases with age, and grand offspring can accumulate, typically what we find is that selection favors early reproduction, right? And typically what we also find is there's very weak selection after post-reproductive survival. So after you sort of finished with your reproductive period, you in general are not under strong selection. And this is one hypothesis for why many of the diseases that exist in human populations now are old age related diseases, right? The idea is that if you're getting that disease only when you're older, there isn't very strong natural selection acting against you, against that disease or carrying that disease, right? Because you already finished with your reproduction. Whereas the diseases or disorders that will have a major impact on your survival or fitness early on are predicted to be under very strong selection. So the frequency typically of sort of debilitating diseases which affect you before you're 20, 25, 30 are going to be very rare in populations typically. No, that's for why you why lifespan is beyond a reproductive age at all. So in humans, for instance, individuals, females particularly, will live for much longer than the age at which they're able to reproduce, right? So menopause is 50, 55 or so in most human populations, and most females in most populations live well beyond 60 now, right? And so question is, why has natural selection not sort of, I don't know, gotten these people to die sooner? And the hypothesis is that, especially in group living organisms such as humans, females that live longer can actually help in grandparental care, and that also increases their fitness, and potentially that's why that's a trait that has survived or evolved in our populations. So that's the grandmother hypothesis.
Since the age, death age has increased, like we can live longer now. So why can't the menopausal age be shifted towards the like beyond 50? Because
Just hasn't. So what's the physiological constraint is that females are born with a fixed number of eggs, and basically what happens in menopause is you run out of them. Right? So unless there are mutations that allow the number of eggs to be higher in females, there's not much that can be done. I mean, that's the way that evolution has to work. Is that?
yeah,
I mean, essentially you can ask the kind of question of why can't this happen with any trait and everything. But in some sense, yeah. But you really need to understand the constraints, yeah.
To the reproductive age. Is that a valid why question? I mean,
No,
if
it's
selection
not.
is not acting on them at all,
No,
so
yeah.
there's no particular reason why they have to die. I mean,
No, yeah, but actually the real question is what he's asking, which is, if you are able to survive to that age, why has selection not, or yeah, can selection not act to increase the reproductive age then? Because clearly that would be beneficial. Right? So an individual who's able to reproduce for the entire life period would have a fitness advantage versus over individuals who don't live, who stop reproducing at some point.
So might it be the consequence of the fact that we have extended our lifespan somewhat artificially, and evolution
Some of it,
with
yeah.
is
So that's
yet to
also
catch up?
another thing that people do mention when talking about this fact, is that if you look at sort of older societies or many tribal societies where people don't use modern medicine as much, you do find that the difference between the reproductive age and the lifespan is not as large. But even there, you do find there is some survival afterwards, after reproductive age is ended. And so yeah, I'm not sure what the consensus on that is at the moment. But yeah, no, good point. Yeah. Reproductive age, do they? Yeah, they may have grandparental, but I don't know if that means that they're not reproducing anymore. I don't know that. Yeah, I just don't know. Okay, I think we talked about this. I think we'll skip this right now. Right, so why don't organisms live forever without growing old? What makes us age? That's another major question, right? I don't think it's haunting any of us at this moment. We're all young enough, but it will start haunting you at some point. So there's a proximate cause, like I mentioned earlier, there are proximate and ultimate causes that sort of evolution helps us think about. At the biological, sort of physiological level, your cells just grow old, right? And one hypothesis is that our cells accumulate mutations over time, and they accumulate toxins over time. Also, our telomeres shorten. Is everyone aware of telomeres? Telomeres are sort of random bits of DNA at the end of our chromosomes, and what happens is every time our cells divide, the telomeres end up shortening, right? And so the idea is eventually you're going to lose your telomeres and get into the real business bits of your chromosome and start losing DNA. And so the hypothesis is that the later cells that are generated by divisions later in your life, the somatic cells that form our skin and things, for instance, are going to carry many more mutations because they've degraded and they've lost their telomeres, right? And the idea is that that makes them less efficient. The ultimate cause is that probably selection and survival decreases with age, and we just discussed this. So once you are sort of nearing the end of your reproductive stage, selection is not as strong. And also there's this hypothesis that there's antagonistic pleiotropy, where mutations which are beneficial early in life, which will say increase your fitness, have a late life cost, right? So the same mutations that are beneficial, that allow us to reproduce earlier in life and better in life, may be deleterious when we get old, because they have multiple functions in the cell in our body, and that is called antagonistic pleiotropy. Pleiotropy is just the fact that when one gene or one enzyme, for instance, is doing multiple functions in the cell, right? And antagonistic is referring to the fact that these oppose each other, the two different functions, right? This is one hypothesis, that that's why we age, is that because selection is strongest early on in life, we end up getting these beneficial mutations, but the byproduct of these mutations is that your fitness is much lower later on, and we don't know them. As far as I know, there are no real examples of these kinds of mutations. There may be some recent work with mice and worms that people have identified that I'm not aware of. But as far as I know, we don't have sort of, here's an enzyme that does this kind of thing. There's lots of theory on this though, and very interesting theoretical work. Okay, so another question is how many offspring and how big should they be? You can have more eggs, but then you maybe can't take care of them very well, or you might have fewer eggs and take really good care of them. You often have to deal also with trade-offs between your own survival versus offspring fitness. Sometimes you observe these sort of dramatic stuff which they'll show you on National Geographic, where a female is killing her own offspring sometimes, right? And that's potentially cases where her own survival and the risk, the perceived risk of her own life versus her future reproduction balances out such that her own survival is more important. You could have parental investment which may be limited, or I mean, this is essentially a similar idea to what is seen here. You can have many weak offspring versus fewer strong offspring. And the idea is you can do this ESS modeling or optimality modeling where you can choose your optimality criteria. You can say, I'm going to optimize lifetime fitness, or I'm going to optimize sort of immediate fitness in my model. And accordingly, you can evaluate different strategies. You can evaluate generalist versus strategies. You can evaluate what is the diet mix that you should be eating. Should you eat just chips and what's your other favorite food? Pakoras? Or should you kind of eat a whole bunch of stuff? And another way to model these, which have been used very successfully in evolutionary biology, is the idea of an evolutionary stable strategy. So this is briefly defined a strategy which cannot be invaded by a mutant, right? So if you have all sort of early reproducers in a population, can a late reproducer invade the population successfully and have better fitness than the others, for instance, right? This has, for instance, been looked at in investment in stem versus foliage in competing plants. So if you have dense forests, should you invest in stem and growing up really tall and getting sunlight, or should you invest in putting out more leaves and therefore capturing more sunlight, right? So these kind of strategies have been looked at. Oh God, I have a whole section of this. Anyway, basically you can modify the initial density dependent equations that I discussed earlier for a single species to talk about multiple species, where you essentially add in a term which is the competition coefficient, saying how much is your fitness affected by individual of the other species. Let's skip this. Right, you have these really cool predator-prey cycles, which we sort of briefly talked about earlier. So here's one of my favorite experiments someone else has done, where they had algae and rotifers which eat algae evolve in these lab populations, and in some cases they didn't let them evolve, okay, and they found that the algae or the rotifer typically went extinct. But if you allowed them to evolve, they would coexist, right? And so this is really interesting, where because of these arms race kind of dynamics that go on between the two interacting species, both of them are able to coexist. Whereas if you basically seed every generation a culture with the original ancestor, which basically now has not evolved, right? Then you have one of them going extinct, always. There's also a lot of work that has happened with population cycling and stability with these lynx and hare populations. You see them beautifully in sync. And so for a long time, people have worked on what causes these cycles. And I don't know what the latest is, but there's everything from solar flares and other non-rabbit prey populations that have featured in this kind of modeling. And I guess someone knows the answer to this, but I don't. The other very interesting thing to think about is host-parasite dynamics, where there's behavior evolutions, where hosts, for instance, oh, this is a really cool story. So there are these butterfly larvae, which have these butterflies which have basically evolved to parasitize these ants. And what they do is the larvae sort of, the butterfly lays its eggs close to the ant nest and travels with the ants inside the nest, and then the larva develops, and it secretes its chemicals that helps it mask itself as if it was an ant larva, and then the ant takes care of it and feeds it, and then it ends up eating other ant larvae while it's in the nest. And so it's a beautiful parasite, and it's this amazing stuff where it has these organs which are these sort of files somewhere in its body where it makes these sounds that even mimic the sounds that the ant larvae make when they're begging for food from the ants. And so this butterfly is basically, the larva has evolved this amazing set of behaviors which allows it to be a fantastic parasite. And so there's very nice behavioral evolution. Here's another example where there's this, I think this is from South America somewhere, where this parasite infects these ants and it turns the abdomen of the ant red, and a non-infected ant looks like this. And then it makes the ant go and hang out on tops of leaves with its butt sticking out. And the idea is that the bird then comes and picks it up and eats it thinking it's a berry. And the parasite needs the bird to complete its life cycle and get dispersed. So there's really amazing and fantastic behavioral evolution that has occurred as a result of these sort of host-parasite dynamics. And that's, again, something that needs a lot more empirical as well as theoretical work. You can also have mutualism or cooperation, not just parasitism. So again, here are examples of coevolution dynamics that have led to beautiful examples of cooperation. Here's these desert plants whose name I forget, but there's birds that pollinate them. And the different plant species have basically specialized to use different pollinators. So there are some plants which use bees as pollinators, some that use birds as pollinators. And the tube length and the corolla length of the plants or the flowers has evolved to match that of its respective pollinator. There are very interesting things we can think of about what are the factors that will lead to coexistence of species. Are there other limiting factors? Are there trade-offs between competitive superiority versus predator susceptibility? So you can be a fantastic, supreme competitor, but you're going to be nailed by some parasite as a result, perhaps. And so that's a trade-off that's going to act on individuals in a population. Yeah, I think let's skip through this for now. Yeah, talking about communities. So I'm sort of taking you through all these different scales at which ecological research is carried out. You can look at individual populations, individuals in a population, look at pairs of interacting species, look at groups of interacting species. And there are very interesting questions here about how communities are assembled, what determines who's in a community, is there any habitat selection going on, how many species there are, how fast does that number of species change or identity of species change. There's a neutral theory of biodiversity by Stephen Hubble, which is, I think, worth reading if you're interested in ecology. And the idea here is that if there were no niches at all, right, if I just take all the species that are there on Earth and sort of randomly throw them around, what kinds of communities would I find? And are those communities quite different from the real communities that I do see, right? And so that's a null hypothesis, which is very nice. What is the effect of removing species from networks? So maybe some of you have heard of these ideas where if you remove a particular pollinator, the entire community is going to collapse. something like that. So people are working on this a lot. And finally, you sort of go to the even higher level where there's multiple communities in a given ecosystem, where the dynamics are affected by resident species, there's migration and dispersal. And finally, there are biogeochemical cycles which determine what goes on. So you've heard of the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle and so on at some point. And so all of these are factors that drive what happens to communities. And this is kind of what I mean by ecosystem. So here's a forest ecosystem from Kerala. You have elephants, you have bamboo forests, you have all these different populations of elephants which come when there is lots of water here. This is a sort of water ecosystem, again from Kerala. These are Myristica swamps, which are very, very interesting and very rare. So these species have adapted to be in these swampy conditions where you can see their root system and their support system is quite different. These are probably one of your favorite ecosystems. Largely plantations, so it's all man-made. This is all coconut plantations in the Andamans. And these are high altitude ecosystems in Sikkim. And there is some bharal sheep somewhere here which you can't see. But basically very little survives here, right? And so there are very distinct set of species with specific adaptations to survive in these kinds of environments and that interact in very interesting ways. I think that's the end of my talk. Any last questions? I think everyone just wants to go and sleep for some time, including me. So yeah, but yeah, any burning questions? You feel free to write to me at some point later. What I've also asked is I've asked Sandeep to email you all a small sort of example that Nature published a few years ago, sort of some fantastic examples of evolution or understanding of evolution that we have in the last few years. So take a look at that if you're interested, and yeah, email me or come find me at some point.